Welcome, weary traveler. You found your way to a quiet corner of the internet, a place where history isn't sharp or urgent, but soft and slow, where the stories of the past unfold gently, like pages turned in a book long left resting on an oak shelf. This is Sleepy Boring History, and tonight, we're going to take a slow walk back in time, not to a battlefield, not to a throne room, but to someplace far more ordinary and far more alive, a medieval tavern. Before we begin, let your shoulders drop, loosen your jaw, take a deep breath in, and let it drift out slowly. Let the worries of the day go quiet for a while. This is your time. No deadlines, no distractions, just the soft hum of the past, and a tale to carry you toward rest. Now, picture this with me. It's late evening, somewhere around the year 1380. The sun has long since dipped below the hills, leaving only a warm trail of fire at the edge of the sky. The air is crisp, laced with the scent of smoke and wet earth. You've walked a long road today, through meadows, along dusty lanes, past farmers returning from the fields and children chasing chickens through muddy streets. At last, ahead of you, a light. It flickers gently through the cracks of timber-framed walls. A small building, lopsided in places, with a thatched roof slightly bowed with age. A sign swings creakily above the doorway, perhaps a faded image of a wild boar, or a tankard, or a bunch of grapes painted in flaking color. You found a tavern, and inside warmth, food, company, and a place to rest your feet. But this isn't a tavern the way we think of bars or pubs today. Oh no, medieval taverns were their own unique blend of the familiar and the strange. A mix of local gossip, strong drink, crusty bread, and communal stories. They weren't just places to eat or drink. They were the beating heart of many medieval communities. Everyone came here. Peasants, merchants, minstrels, pilgrims, even knights with sore feet and dusty cloaks. Taverns were where you heard the latest news, whether from the next village over or from someone who'd returned from the Holy Land. They were where marriages were arranged, debts were settled, songs were shared, and dice were rolled. And yes, sometimes tempers flared, and tankards flew, but just as often the night ended with snores by the hearth and the gentle clink of coin, traded for a bed of straw. Over the next little while, we'll step fully into this world. I'll take you through the heavy wooden doors of a medieval tavern. We'll look at the food on the table, the smoke curling from the fire, and the way candlelight flickers across faces half lost in shadow. You'll hear the music, simple, sweet, the kind that loops endlessly in your mind as you drift off. And we'll listen to the chatter of voices, the gentle lull of life lived slowly. But don't worry about keeping track of the details. You're not here to take notes or remember dates. You're just here to let the past wash over you, like a warm bath drawn at the end of a long day. And if you find your eyelids growing heavier with each moment, that's perfectly fine. This isn't history for tests or textbooks. This is history for sleep. Tonight, our journey is not to a famous cathedral, or the castle of a mighty king. We're going somewhere far more ordinary, and far more real. We're going where the people were, where they gathered, where they laughed, where they told stories long after the sun had gone down. We're going to the tavern. So are you ready? In the soft candle light, the tavern door opens slowly. The warmth of the hearth touches your face. You hear music, gentle, plucked on a lute. The smell of something roasting on a spit fills the air. Someone lifts a tankard. Another laughs softly, a sound like wind through dry leaves. And you step inside. From here, we'll take it slow. We'll explore the corners of this world one by one. Who ran the taverns, who visited, what they ate, what they drank, how they passed the time. Every little detail, every sleepy note. But for now, just let the image settle in your mind. The gentle glow of fire, the hum of conversation, the rough timber beams above your head, and the feeling of being safe, warm, and welcome. Welcome to the past. Welcome to the tavern. Let us settle in a little deeper now. As the fire crackles softly in the corner, and your feet begin to warm, you've stepped inside a place both strange and familiar, a medieval tavern. But what was a tavern, truly? And how was it different from an inn or an alehouse? In the modern world, we often lump these places together. We might picture a pub in the English countryside, or a warm wooden bar tucked into a village square. But in the Middle Ages, there were important distinctions, differences not just in name, but in purpose, in clientele, and in the kinds of things you could find behind their crooked old doors. To begin with, Let's start with the three main types of medieval drinking establishments: the alehouse, the inn, and the tavern. Each played a role in the community, and while their functions sometimes overlap, the differences could matter quite a bit to the people of the time. An alehouse, the most humble of the three, was typically just that, a house that served ale. Simple, earthy, and deeply rooted in the rural communities of medieval Europe. Alehouses were often run out of private homes. A widow or farmer's wife might brew her own ale and hang a leafy branch or a pole outside the door as a sign that ale was available. You could stop in, sip a mug of something freshly brewed, and perhaps stay a few minutes or a few hours before returning to the field or road. Alehouses were informal, intimate, and entirely local. They were where the laborers drank. They were where gossip brewed just as easily as the ale itself. An inn, on the other hand, was something quite different. Inns were meant for travelers. They were larger, more expensive, and provided overnight lodging in addition to food and drink. Inns were often located along major roads, near town gates, or in busy marketplaces. A merchant traveling from city to city might spend the night at an inn, stable his horse, and conduct a bit of business over supper. They were more respectable than alehouses, sometimes even a little refined, with stricter rules and more consistent service. Inns might be connected to guilds or licensed by the local lord, and in some cases, they were staffed by those with connections to the church, especially if the inn served pilgrims on holy journeys. And then there was the tavern. The tavern was something in between. Taverns specialized in wine, not ale, at least at first. In many places, the word tavern comes from the Latin taberna, which originally meant a shop or stall. Over time, though, taverns evolved into full social centers. Unlike the rustic alehouse or the practical inn, the tavern was a place to linger. It wasn't just about drinking, it was about talking, listening, watching, playing, eating, and sometimes even scheming. It was a public space, but also an intimate one, and it was usually found in the heart of the town or village, near the marketplace, the church, or the town square. A tavern was not necessarily meant for sleeping, though some had private rooms or lofts where a traveler might pay to rest. What defined the tavern most was its function. It was a gathering place, a hub of food, drink, news, and rest for the local community. People went to the tavern to socialize, to unwind, to hear songs and stories, or to exchange the latest tidbits of gossip. It was a kind of medieval living room, only with strangers, and with a great deal more alcohol. In a world without phones or newspapers, the tavern was how you found out what was going on. Had the bishop fallen ill? Was there trouble on the road from the next town? Had the king declared a new tax? Or had someone's daughter run off with the blacksmith's apprentice? The tavern was where you heard it first. And if you wanted to spread a rumor, there was no better place to start. In cities, taverns could be quite elaborate. Carved woodwork, colorful signs, stone floors, even private booths or curtained rooms for business or pleasure. In smaller villages, they were simpler, just one or two rooms, a hearth, and a few tables. But whether grand or humble, they were vital to medieval life. Taverns were also places where the lines between classes could blur, just a little. A merchant might rub shoulders with a traveling minstrel. A journeyman craftsman might sit across from a village reeve. The Lord Steward might stop in for a drink, though the Lord himself would rarely be seen. It wasn't quite an egalitarian space, but it was one of the few where people from different walks of life could occupy the same room for a time. And what did you find inside? Aside from the drink, which we'll talk about soon, you'd find simple furnishings, heavy wooden tables, benches or stools, and always a fire. The hearth was the heart of the tavern, where food was cooked, where people gathered, and where, on a cold night, you might stretch out on the stone floor for a bit of sleep. Might be hung with old tools, if you had nowhere else to go, dried herbs, or even a faded tapestry if the owner was doing well. In wealthier regions, there might be stained glass in the windows or a painted ceiling overhead. But most of all, the tavern was defined by its sounds and smells: the crackling fire, the murmur of conversation, the clink of mugs, the scent of roasted meat and wood smoke and worn wool. It's important to remember that taverns were also regulated. In many towns, you couldn't just open one without permission. Local authorities issued licenses and controlled prices. There were rules about how much wine or ale could be sold, about when the tavern had to close, and even about the quality of the drink. In some places, tavern keepers had to post the prices of their beverages on a wooden board, where customers could see them, an early attempt at consumer protection. And yet, despite these rules, taverns could be wild. They were often places of trouble as much as peace. Fights broke out. Dice games led to arguments. Thieves made deals in corners. Lovers met in secret. And sometimes, the authorities turned a blind eye, because they, too, liked a good drink and a warm fire now and then. So when we speak of a medieval tavern, we're not just speaking of a building. We're speaking of a social space, a node in the network of daily life, a place where time slowed, where people gathered, and where, for better or worse, the real life of the Middle Ages unfolded, not in silence, not in solitude, but in voices rising softly over wine, in laughter echoing off stone walls, in the gentle closing of a wooden door against the cold night air. This was a medieval tavern, and it was here that life happened, not the kind recorded in royal chronicles, but the kind whispered about in quiet voices, and remembered only by those who were there. Now that you know what a tavern was, let's continue our slow journey and meet the people who ran them. In the next chapter, we'll get to know the tavern keepers, the quiet stewards of warmth, ale, and rumor. But for now, let the fire burn low, let the voices drift into murmurs, and rest in the comfort of a place well worn and well loved. Now that we've stepped into the flickering warmth of the medieval tavern, it's time to meet the people who kept it all running, the quiet orchestrators of the clatter and hum, the ones who stirred the stew, poured the ale, stoked the fire, and kept a watchful eye on the crowd. Let's sit back and learn about the tavern keeper. In your mind's eye, you might picture a burly man with rolled-up sleeves, wiping down a wooden counter with a rag, or perhaps a motherly woman in a linen apron, bustling between tables with a pot of steaming broth. And truthfully, you'd be right. Either could have been the face behind the tavern door. Taverns, unlike inns or noble households, were not always run by men. In fact, women often played a significant role in the day-to-day life of medieval taverns. In many cases, they were the primary keepers. These women, known as alewives or tavernieresses, brewed, served, cleaned, and managed the finances. Sometimes they were widows, left with a bit of property and turning it into a place of income. Other times, they were wives helping their husbands run a family business. In towns and cities, where licenses and regulations became more strict, male tavern keepers were more common, especially when official status and guild membership were required. But in rural areas and village streets, women's presence behind the counter was a norm rather than an exception. Regardless of gender, a tavern keeper's job was no small task. They had to manage supplies, securing enough wine or ale to serve, finding affordable food to cook and sell, keeping track of what was owed and what had been paid. Some of them brewed their own ale, especially if they were closer to the alehouse side of things. Others bought wine from local merchants or traveling vintners. If the tavern was large enough, it might have had its own cellar, where barrels were rolled in and stacked beside hanging hams and baskets of root vegetables. And then there were the customers. The tavern keeper had to be part host, part enforcer, part mediator. They had to be able to charm a stranger, silence a rowdy drunk, and spot a cheater at dice, all without spilling a drop. They had to be alert, even while smiling. A spilled drink could be cleaned up, a broken table could be mended, but a brawl could bring in the constable, fines, or worse, a damaged reputation. In towns, tavern keepers often had to maintain good standing with the local authorities. They might need a license to operate, and if they failed to follow the rules, serving after curfew, for example, or selling watered-down wine, they could be fined or even shut down. This made record-keeping important. Some taverners kept written accounts, tallying how much they sold, who owed what, and what came in each week. Others did it all by memory, relying on years of habit and a sharp mind honed through repetition. Let's pause for a moment and imagine one such keeper. Picture a man in his 50s. His hair is mostly gray, his beard thick but tidy. His hands are large, stained with wine from years of working barrels. He moves slowly, deliberately, but his eyes miss nothing. He greets a customer with a low nod, then turns and lifts a heavy mug from beneath the counter. Behind him, his daughter is stirring a pot over the hearth, and his son is sweeping near the door. It's a family affair. Everyone has a role, Or perhaps you see a woman instead. Her dress is simple, patched but clean. Her apron is dusted with flour, and she has the sort of firm gaze that makes even the rowdiest merchant think twice. She knows everyone in the village by name. She remembers who owes her a coin, who prefers their ale warmed, and who shouldn't be allowed to play dice when they've had more than 3 mugs. She's kind, but not soft. Some tavern keepers ran their establishments with flair, becoming local personalities in their own right. A clever taverner might befriend the local bailiff, make deals with farmers to get the best cuts of meat, and even hire a minstrel to play music on feast days. Others kept to themselves, quietly opening their doors each night, letting the business flow around them like a stream, steady and predictable. Hiring help was common in larger taverns. A bustling city tavern might employ serving boys or girls to carry platters of food, fetch water, or clean up after guests. There might be a cook working in the back, or a stable hand outside tending to the horses of traveling patrons. In wealthier establishments, a clerk might handle the money, especially if the tavern doubled as a meeting house or business venue. The relationships between tavern keepers and the local community could be complex. They might be respected for providing a much-needed service, or gossiped about, especially if the tavern had a reputation for raucous nights. In some towns, tavern keepers were viewed as moral risks, especially if gambling, lewd songs, or illicit meetings were suspected to occur under their roof. In others, they were valued community members, contributing to local events and even serving on councils or helping to mediate disputes. The tavern keeper also played a quiet but essential role in the spread of information. Travelers brought news, and taverners listened. They passed on word of road conditions, trade disruptions, rumors of war, or the health of distant relatives. In a world without newspapers or radios, a good tavern keeper was as much a broadcaster as a barkeep. They were trusted, and sometimes feared, for what they knew. And then there were the tavern keepers, who pushed the limits. Some broke the rules, brewing unlicensed ale or serving forbidden beverages. Some welcomed shady deals or ran side businesses, selling charms, arranging discreet meetings, or turning a blind eye to smuggled goods. These were the exceptions, not the rule, but the possibility always lingered in the candlelit shadows. Whether upstanding or slippery, beloved or begrudged, the people who owned and ran taverns were deeply embedded in the medieval world. They were more than shopkeepers. They were hosts, cooks, confidants, and gatekeepers to the town's inner life. So the next time you imagine a medieval scene, not a king on a throne or a knight in battle, but a quiet corner of daily life, think of the tavern keeper. With sleeves rolled up, they tend the hearth. They refill your cup with practiced ease. They smile faintly as the laughter rises and the fire dims. And when the door creaks open with the cold night wind, they're the first to see who's come, and the first to welcome them in. Imagine it now. You've been walking for hours. Your boots are damp with mud. The wind whispers in the trees and pulls at your cloak. The road behind you is quiet, and the one ahead feels endless. But there, just over the rise, is a faint glow, a warm little dot in the dark, calling you closer. As you draw near, the sound of your footsteps crunching on gravel mixes with another sound, muffled voices, laughter, the distant clink of wood against wood. A sign hangs from a crooked beam above the doorway, its paint faded and edges worn by rain and time. Perhaps it shows a painted fox, or a cup, or a crown of ivy. There's no lettering. Most people can't read, but the image says enough. This is a tavern. The door is thick, made from old planks fitted tightly together with iron nails. It creaks on its hinges as you push it open, and then, like a sudden breath of life, you're inside. The first thing that hits you is the warmth. It's not just heat from the hearth, though the fire burns bright at the far end of the room. It's something deeper, a feeling of shelter, of being enclosed. The cold wind stays outside now. The walls are thick, the ceiling low. Wooden beams stretch across above your head, blackened with age and smoke. The air is full of smells, roasted meat, old wood, damp wool, and the sweet mustiness of spilled ale soaked into floorboards over years. You take a step forward, and the floor creaks beneath you. You're not alone. The tavern isn't crowded, but it's not empty either. At one table, a trio of old men lean close over a game of dice, their fingers twitching with excitement. At another, a merchant with a wide-brimmed hat argues in hushed tones with a traveling friar. In the corner, A young woman hums a soft tune as she wipes down mugs with a cloth that's seen better days. No one really looks up. You're just another traveler, perhaps from 2 villages away, perhaps from the next kingdom over. It doesn't matter. The tavern has space for all. To your left is a long wooden bench, polished smooth by years of use. The table before it is nicked and stained. A candle flickers in a little iron holder. Wax drips slowly down its sides, pooling in hardened puddles around the base. A pewter mug sits near the edge, half full. No one seems to own it. You take a seat. This is what entering a tavern feels like in the Middle Ages. It's not glamorous. It's not loud. It's not even especially clean. But it is real. And in a world of harsh labor, long winters, and uncertain roads, a place like this is precious. Not for its comfort, but for its familiarity, for its life. You look around. Behind the main counter, little more than a slab of wood, on a pair of barrels, stands the tavern keeper. He nods at you, not smiling, not frowning, just a quiet recognition. You're welcome here, but you'll earn no special treatment. If you have coin, you'll eat. If you don't, you'll make do with what your smile or your story can buy. Along the back wall, there are bundles of herbs hanging from nails. Rosemary, thyme, maybe something else, lavender or wormwood. They're here more for scent than flavor, and they help mask the more pungent smells of humanity packed into close quarters. To the side of the hearth, a small dog sleeps curled in a ragged pile of cloth. Its ears twitch occasionally. Nearby, a pair of boots dry on a stone ledge, left there by a guest who's made himself at home. The tavern is dimly lit. Candles and oil lamps don't give off much glow, and the hearth does most of the work. Shadows leap across the walls, dancing to the rhythm of the flames. Everything feels soft, a little hazy, like the world has been wrapped in a warm blanket of time. Occasionally, a gust of wind rattles the shuttered windows. The wooden slats knock softly, but they hold firm. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, there's only the low murmur of voices and the occasional laughter of someone a few drinks in. A boy walks past, no older than 10. He's barefoot, and he carries a bowl of stew in both hands, careful not to spill. It's thick, fragrant, dotted with carrots and little lumps of meat that could be rabbit or goose or something less certain. He delivers it to an old woman near the hearth, who nods and drops a coin into his hand without looking. You notice a musician now, seated on a stool near the fire. He strums a lute, soft, slow chords that float through the air like fog. He doesn't sing, not yet, just plays. It's enough. The tune is old. You think you might have heard it before, in another village, another time. Or maybe you're imagining that. That's the magic of the tavern. It's always new, but always the same. Overhead, the rafters creak. You glance up. There's a loft above, a sleeping space for those who pay for it, or perhaps a storage area for barrels and sacks of barley. Either way, the building feels alive, as if it breathes with its own lungs. Wood expands and contracts. Fire hisses. Someone sneezes. A chair is pushed back. And then, from a far table, a voice begins to tell a story. Something about a knight, or a fox, or a ghost in the woods. You don't hear the whole thing, just fragments. But the tone is friendly, and the listener laughs softly, and the teller beams with pride. There's no rush, no need to understand every word. You're here now, safe from the cold. You have a seat and a drink. You're part of the fabric, the background noise, the rhythm of tavern life. Time moves differently inside a medieval tavern. There are no clocks, no bells, except the ones at the church that ring out across the town square. But here, in this space, the hours are measured by candles burned low, and stories half told, by mugs emptied, dice cast, and stew scraped clean from the bottom of a bowl. Eventually, you might rise. You might offer a coin for another drink, or nod off where you sit, your head resting on your arm, the warmth of the fire lulling you into sleep. And if you do, no one will wake you. Not right away. Sleep is common in places like this. Not just the sleep of the body, but the sleep of thought, the drifting into memory, the slipping into dreams. To enter a tavern in the Middle Ages was to enter something like a pause, a small, brief break from the world outside, from toil, from rules, from loneliness. And in its place, a slow unfolding of human presence, of voices, of music, of shared warmth. So here you are. The fire crackles. The door creaks, and the candle burns low. You are welcome. You are safe. And your story, whatever it may be, has found a place to rest. Now that the door has closed gently behind you, and your seat is taken, let's stay here for a little while. Let's not rush ahead. There's time for stew, time for stories, time for all the things that make up this gentle world. For now, let's just look around and listen. The atmosphere inside a medieval tavern was something between a sigh and a murmur. Dim, slow, alive with the hum of ordinary people sharing ordinary lives. It was not grand, it was not neat, but it was real, and it was full. The lighting, to begin with, was always low. No electric bulbs, no lamps brightening corners, only candles, small, uneven, flickering, and the orange glow of the central fire. If the tavern had money, there might be a few iron sconces along the walls, or a lantern hanging from a beam, its glass smoked over with soot. But most often, light came from the hearth itself. The flames snapped and hissed, sending dancing shadows across every wall, making every movement, every hand lifted to a mug, every nod of a head, look more dreamlike, more distant, as though everything inside existed slightly out of time. The air was thick with smoke, not the choking smoke of disaster, but the settled smoke of long use, layers upon layers of fires lit, day after day, season after season. It clung to the beams overhead, darkening the wood. It wove into the clothes of every person sitting inside. You smelled like the tavern long after you left it, like fire, and ash, and food that had simmered for hours. Some nights, if the chimney wasn't drawing properly, the smoke would drift sideways across the room. You could see it in the glow of the firelight, curling like breath, soft and slow. And always, underneath everything, the sounds, not loud, not jarring, but constant. The soft clink of wooden tankards being set down, the scrape of a stool as someone shifted their weight, a low voice, a faint laugh, the whistle of a kettle from behind the hearth, dice rolling across a table and coming to a stop, the dog in the corner letting out a breath through its nose. No one shouted, or at least, not often. Loud voices were unwelcome unless there was music or celebration. Mostly, people spoke in that tavern tone, a low murmur, close to the ear, like a secret shared between friends. And the furniture, it told its own story. Tables were heavy, worn, often made of oak or elm. Nothing matched. One table might be long and rectangular, another square. You sat wherever there was room. It was not like a restaurant, where tables were reserved. You sat with whoever was there, a farmer, a stranger, a merchant with tired eyes. There was no privacy, only presence. The stools were simple, often three-legged, and low to the ground. Most had no backs. They wobbled slightly. Some had bits of straw stuffed under one leg to keep them steady. The more permanent ones were just benches, long and thick, sometimes fixed to the floor. You didn't sit for elegance. You sat for warmth, for company, and to let your bones rest from a day of walking or working. At the center of most taverns was the fireplace, large, open, and always burning if the weather was cool, which it often was. The hearth was more than heat. It was light, cooking space, and social heart. People naturally gathered around it. The stew pot hung from an iron hook over the flame. A kettle rested in the coals. Dry boots steamed near the edge. Someone always seemed to be tending it, poking the logs, adding a fresh one, adjusting the embers. And the sound of the fire, the steady, soft pop and crackle, was like the tavern's breath. Slow, constant, comforting. The walls of the tavern were often dark. Not painted, usually, but just aged wood, stained by time and weather. You might see bundles of dried herbs hanging from hooks. Maybe a set of antlers mounted over the door. A faded bit of cloth or a wooden carving in one corner. Decorations were sparse. Everything inside had a purpose, whether practical or superstitious. A branch of rowan to ward off spirits. A scrap of linen painted with a saint's face. A lucky horseshoe nailed above the hearth. The floor, hard-packed earth in the simplest places. In wealthier taverns, stone or uneven wood planks, slick with age and ale. In winter, rushes were spread on the floor, straw mixed with herbs like lavender or mint, to sweeten the air and soak up spills. They were changed, when they grew to dirty, which was not as often as you might like. You walked carefully. You accepted a little mess. That was part of it. The tavern was not polished. It was not clean by modern standards. But it was lived in. That was its charm. The worn surfaces, the crooked beams, the smoke-darkened rafters, they told stories. Every mark, Every groove in the wood was the memory of 1,000 evenings just like this one. And it wasn't all stillness. Movement happened too, but gently. A serving girl passed between tables, her apron dusted with flour. A man shifted his seat closer to the fire. Someone pulled out a pouch of coins and spilled them slowly onto the table. 1, 2, 3. There was always something happening, but it never felt rushed. Time moved at the pace of the fire, at the speed of a song being plucked slowly on a lute, at the rhythm of a tale told without hurry. There might be a cat curled up on a window ledge, eyes half closed, or a hen tucked into the corner if the tavern served breakfast and needed fresh eggs. These weren't out of place. Animals were part of tavern life, just like the people, quiet, unbothered, present. Even the smells, though thick, had a strange comfort. Smoke and meat, ale and sweat, wet wool and herbs. In the modern world, we're used to separation. Perfumes cover up life. But here, in the tavern, everything blended together. The scents were part of the story, part of what made the room feel alive. If you stayed long enough, you might forget the cold outside. You might lean your elbow on the table, close your eyes for just a moment. Let the voices become background. Let the fire warm your cheek. Let the tankard rest in your hand. This was the world inside the tavern, a world apart from the storms, the politics, the hunger, and the toil. A place not of luxury, but of relief. A place where time softened, where people became stories, and where stories became memory. So rest here a little longer. Let the music drift over you like dust. Let the laughter melt into the crackling fire. Let the old beams creak above you. You are warm. You are safe. And the night is long and quiet. Let's close our eyes for a moment. No need to look around. You're already seated. The fire is glowing softly, and the room hums around you, like a slow lullaby. Now, just breathe in. In a medieval tavern, scent was one of the most vivid parts of the experience. Stronger than sight, more lasting than sound. The smells told you everything. Where you were, what time it was, what kind of night it might become. The first scent, rich, earthy, welcoming, is stew. It's been simmering for hours over the fire, tucked into a big iron pot that hangs just above the glowing embers. The smell fills the room, weaving its way through the air like a slow fog. This is not the stew of modern kitchens. It doesn't smell like fresh thyme and tender beef. It smells like root vegetables pulled from the soil, like onions that have been stored in a cellar since autumn, like bits of salted pork fat bubbling slowly into broth. Maybe there's cabbage in the pot, maybe a handful of peas. If the tavern's had a good week, there might be chunks of rabbit or duck, perhaps even a knuckle of lamb bone giving up its marrow to the heat. It's savory and strong and just a little sour around the edges, because the meat isn't always fresh. But it's nourishing, familiar, a scent you'd recognize in any town, in any village, from the mountains of Wales to the forests of Bohemia. And underneath the stew, wrapping around it like a heavy cloak, is the scent of old wood. The beams above you, the table under your arms, the floor beneath your feet, all of it soaked in age. Wood that's absorbed not just smoke, but centuries of footsteps, slow stale, and spilled stew. It's dry and dusty, but not unpleasant. The kind of smell you only get from something that's survived generations. Old wood has memory. It smells like time. Now shift a little in your seat, and you'll catch something else. Something musty, sharp, and unmistakable. Stale ale. It's in the air, in the tables, in the floorboards. Ale, especially in these days, wasn't stored in bottles or neatly poured. It was ladled or sloshed, or dumped from barrels into wooden mugs and tankards. And not all of it made it to the drinker's mouth. Some spilled down chins. Some was knocked over in excitement. Some was simply forgotten. It soaked into the tavern over the years, becoming part of the atmosphere. This scent is a little yeasty, a little sour, almost like old bread left out too long. But there's sweetness in it too. Malted grains and fermented barley. The ghost of 100 toasts. 1,000 stories told over mugs that were never quite empty. You inhale again. There it is, that familiar weight in the air, smoke. Not from a chimney far above, but from the hearth that burns in the center of the room. It clings to your clothes, curls into your hair. It smells of ash and oak, maybe a little pine if someone tossed in a green log too early. If there's a draft tonight, the smoke may drift low, wrapping around your ankles, then swirling slowly toward the rafters. This isn't the acrid smoke of a fire gone wrong. It's the gentle, woody smoke of a controlled burn. Comforting, intimate. It adds to the sense of enclosure, of being tucked away from the outside world. Smoke is the tavern's signature. You carry it with you long after you leave. But not every scent is so cozy. Every so often, depending on the season or the tavern's location, there's something less pleasant. Livestock. Not a barnyard, not overpowering, just a faint whiff. A reminder. Maybe there's a pig pen near the back. Maybe a mule is tied up just outside the door. Maybe a chicken strayed inside and now pecks lazily at the rushes on the floor. The scent is faint, animal, real, a little musky, not offensive, just earthy. It reminds you that this is not a world of clean lines and sealed doors. People live close to animals. They rely on them. And sometimes, the boundaries blur. Alongside this, if you pay attention, you might catch a hint of sweat. Not strong, not harsh, but undeniably human. After all, people have been walking, working, traveling. Bathing is not daily. Wool holds moisture. Leather holds heat. It's part of the mix. The room holds the scent of bodies, not in discomfort, but in truth. This is a place for the weary, the hungry, the real. But not all unexpected smells are unpleasant. Sometimes, woven through the stew and the smoke, you might catch a flash of something brighter, not in the food, but hanging from the rafters or tucked into the rushes on the floor. Dried rosemary, perhaps, lavender, wormwood or sage. These aren't just for decoration. They help mask the other smells, and they speak to a kind of folk wisdom, scents that keep away bad spirits, that settle the stomach, that remind people of health and home. If you lean near the hearth, you might also smell candle wax, warm, slightly metallic, with the faintest scent of beeswax if you're lucky. Most candles are made from tallow, animal fat, and they have a stronger, more pungent aroma when burned. But some taverns, especially in towns, can afford a few beeswax candles, and their scent is sweet, clean, almost like honey after it's been toasted. And finally, there's the subtle but ever-present smell of wet wool. Coats, cloaks, mittens, all steaming gently by the fire after a cold day outside. It's a heavy, damp scent, like old blankets and muddy boots. It fills the corners of the tavern in colder months, wrapping everything in a sense of slow thaw. You can smell the season in it, autumn's rot, winter's frost, spring's early rains. It's the smell of being inside when the world outside is gray and dripping. All of these scents blend together. They do not compete. They do not shout. They settle. They fold around you like a thick, heavy quilt. You stop noticing each individual one. Instead, you feel them as a whole, the scent of the tavern itself. It is not clean, but it is honest. It is not fresh, but it is familiar. You breathe it in again, and slowly you relax. The outside world disappears a little more. The stew bubbles gently. The smoke curls upward, and the scent of old wood, old stories, and old lives hangs softly in the air around you. Let's imagine you've been on the road all day. Mud on your boots, cold wind on your cheeks, your stomach gently growling, not demanding, just reminding you that it's been far too long since morning. And now, here you are, safe inside a quiet tavern, seated near the hearth, warmed by the soft glow of firelight and the comfort of low voices. You can smell the stew, of course. But now, let's think about what's actually on the menu, what you might eat, quietly, slowly, spoon in hand, as the hours drift by. Medieval tavern food was never fancy. There were no menus chalked on a board, no waiters listing specials of the day. Instead, it was simple, filling fare, designed to warm the belly and stretch the ingredients. You didn't eat for excitement. You ate for sustenance, for strength, and sometimes just to stay warm. Let's start with the most common dish of all, pottage. Pottage was the medieval answer to everything, a kind of thick stew, or a porridge, depending on the day. It could be made with grains like barley or oats, thickened with peas or lentils, flavored with onions or leeks, and simmered for hours until it turned soft and hearty. A bit of cabbage might go in, or a few garlic cloves. Sometimes it was brown and nutty, other times greenish and herb-heavy. If meat was available, it would be added in small pieces, scraps of pork, or a bone from yesterday's roast, just enough to flavor the pot. But most of the time, pottage was meatless. That was fine. It was hot, and it was enough. A spoonful was satisfying, not because it was rich, but because it felt like something your grandmother might make, a meal that remembered you. Alongside your pottage, you would almost certainly receive bread. Coarse, dense, and dark, made from rye, barley, or oats, not the white flour we know today. In many taverns, the bread came from a local baker, bought in wheels or loaves. It was sliced thick and often a little stale, just enough to hold together when dunked in broth. This bread wasn't soft. It had weight. It filled your stomach, slowly, surely, making the stew stretch further. Next came cheese, a quiet, humble presence on the tavern table, usually hard or semi-hard, often goat or sheep's milk, with a salty tang and a bit of dryness. Nothing fancy, no brie or camembert, just good, reliable cheese that kept well and added flavor to a very plain meal. You might slice it with your knife, or crumble it into your bread. Sometimes it was rubbed with herbs. Sometimes it was just cheese. And that was enough. There was also salted meat, though not always. Preserved pork, dried beef, or smoked sausage, whatever the season had allowed. Meat was expensive, and fresh meat even more so. So most tavern meats were cured, to last through the weeks when hunting was poor, and livestock had to be spared. Salted bacon might come in thin strips. Dried sausage might be sliced and chewed slowly. These were strong, salty, chewy bits, not tender, not juicy, but they brought a richness to the meal, especially when paired with bread and ale. Occasionally, just occasionally, you might be lucky enough to find roasted game or fresh fish. If the tavern was near a forest, and a hunter had brought in a rabbit or pheasant, it might be roasted slowly over the hearth. The smell of roasting meat would drift through the room, crispy skin, sizzling fat, the sharp tang of herbs rubbed into the flesh. Game was lean, sometimes tough, but flavorful, and it came with a kind of celebratory air. Roasted hare wasn't just food, it was event food, the kind of dish that made people lean in and watch it turn on the spit. Fish, too, had its days. In towns near rivers or the coast, fish was common fare, especially on Fridays and during religious fasting. Salt cod, if it had traveled from far away, might be rehydrated and cooked with onions and vinegar. Local eels were prized in England, boiled or roasted. In warmer regions, sardines or anchovies might be grilled and served with oil and herbs. Even the poorest tavern could sometimes serve pickled herring or dried whiting, soaked and fried. But again, these were occasional. They depended on region, on season, on the luck of the day. On quieter nights, the food was simpler still. A bowl of gruel, made from oats and water, flavored with salt or perhaps a splash of ale. Maybe a plate of peas and beans, mashed and served cold. Or a hard-boiled egg, if the tavern kept hens. These were quiet meals, humble and silent. You wouldn't find sweets here, not often. Sugar was rare, expensive, a luxury. But once in a while, someone might bring dried fruit, figs from abroad, or raisins pressed into a small pie. Honey might be drizzled over bread, especially for a guest of status. And if it was a holiday, say, Christmas or a saint's feast, there might be nut cakes or spiced wafers, baked by hand, passed around the room like a gift. Drinks, too, added their own quiet flavor to the meal. Ale was the staple, thick, yeasty, and low in alcohol, enough to wash down bread and soften the salt of meat. It was often cloudy, slightly sour, sometimes warm. In smaller taverns, it was brewed in-house. In towns, it came from nearby brewers in wooden barrels. If you were lucky, or wealthier, you might sip wine, usually red, often spiced. Mulled wine with cloves and cinnamon was a winter treat, warming the belly and lifting the mood. In coastal regions, cider made from apples was common, sweet and dry and sometimes fizzy. And of course, water was almost never served alone. Too risky, too unclear. You drank ale because it was safer, because the brewing process made it cleaner. Water was for cooking, for bathing, not for mugs. So there you are, with your bowl of pottage, your chunk of bread, your slice of cheese, and a bit of salted meat. Maybe you dip the bread into the stew, scoop a bit of cheese onto it, take a long sip of ale. It is not a banquet, but it is deeply satisfying. This food didn't try to impress. It tried to nourish. It didn't dazzle. It endured. It was food that remembered how hard life could be, and how important it was to have a hot meal at the end of a long day. And that's what made it so special. You didn't eat with silver. You didn't eat with ceremony. You ate with presence. In the warmth of the tavern, near the fire, with the scents of stew and wood and ale filling the air, you took a bite, and in that moment, nothing else really mattered. Now that your bowl of pottage is empty, and your last bite of bread has gone soft in the broth, you reach for your drink. The tavern is quiet around you. Only the clink of mugs, the occasional soft laugh, and the creak of a bench under someone shifting their weight. In a medieval tavern, what was in your cup wasn't just for thirst. It was for safety, for warmth, for comfort. Drinking wasn't about celebration. It was about survival. Because, quite simply, you couldn't trust the water. Water was drawn from wells, or rivers, or communal cisterns. And while it might be clear and cold at the source, it could just as easily be teeming with bacteria, especially in towns and cities. Sewage, animals, and waste often found their way into the same streams that fed the village. So instead, people turned to drinks that had been fermented or boiled, not because they wanted to get drunk, but because these drinks were safer. The most common drink, without a doubt, was ale. Ale wasn't the kind of heavy, bitter beer you might picture today. Medieval ale was usually anopt, which meant it didn't have that sharp, bitter edge. Instead, it was mild, cloudy, and slightly sweet. It was made from malted barley, water, and yeast, and brewed in small batches, often right in the tavern itself, or by local women known as alewives. Most importantly, it was low in alcohol. Very low. Maybe 1 to 2%, just enough to make it clean, but not enough to make it intoxicating. You could drink it all day, and most people did. Workers drank it in the morning before heading out to the fields. Children drank it, too. Watered down and called small ale. It was nourishment as much as refreshment. The brewing process mattered. The grains were steeped in warm water, releasing sugars. The liquid, called wort, was boiled, which helped purify it. Yeast was added, and it was left to ferment for a few days. The result was a drink with body, warmth, and just a touch of fizz. It didn't keep long, though. Ale spoiled quickly, so it was brewed often, drunk fast, and always tasted just a little different from batch to batch. In some places, particularly regions with apple orchards, people also drank cider. Cider was made from crushed apples, left to ferment naturally. It was usually stronger than ale, closer to modern wine in alcohol content, but still far gentler than spirits. In Normandy, in parts of England and Spain, cider was especially popular. It was tart, sometimes sweet, sometimes sharp, and unlike ale, it could be stored a bit longer. If you were in the right region or the right season, you might even come across perry, made from fermented pears. It was rarer, more delicate, but still part of the tavern scene in places with pear trees, and the tools to press them. Then there was mead, the drink of legend, of feasts, of winter nights with stories and songs. Mead was made by fermenting honey with water, sometimes with herbs or fruit added in. It was sweeter than ale, richer than cider, and often associated with special occasions. Because honey was precious, mead was not an everyday drink. It was for guests, for weddings, for Yule celebrations. It came in small wooden cups or pottery mugs, sipped slowly and savored. Its taste was deep, golden, like sunlight trapped in a bottle. It warmed the chest as it went down. Not sharp, not biting, but mellow, like the last light of a long summer day. Wine, too, had its place, but it depended greatly on where you were. In southern Europe, France, Italy, Spain, wine was far more common, grown locally and consumed regularly. In northern Europe, it was rarer, often imported, and usually more expensive. Still, even in England or Germany, wine could be found in taverns near trade routes or wealthy towns. But medieval wine was not like the refined vintages of today. It was often young, sour, and weak, what we might call table wine. It was sometimes diluted with water, or heated and spiced. Cloves, cinnamon, ginger, even pepper might be added to cover imperfections. This spiced wine, known as hickory or mulled wine, was especially popular in the colder months. You wouldn't drink wine from a crystal glass. You'd drink it from a pottery cup, maybe with both hands if the rim was wide. It was red, mostly. White wines existed, but they were rare and even more delicate to store and transport. And then, for those truly looking to warm themselves, or to forget a bit of the world, there was something stronger, brandy, or distilled spirits. But this was rare, very rare. Distillation was still in its early stages in the medieval period, and strong liquors were more often used medicinally than socially. You might find a tiny cup of distilled wine, aquavite, or water of life, served to the ill, or sold by an apothecary. But in taverns, it was ale, cider, or wine that flowed freely. Of course, drinks weren't served in glass. Glass was expensive, fragile, and rare in the Middle Ages. Most drinks came in wooden mugs, ceramic jugs, or leather tankards. In some places, horn cups were used, especially in the north. The vessel didn't matter much, only that it held enough. Taverns didn't pour with precision. There were no standard pints or measured pours. A serving of ale was whatever the mug held. A jug of wine might be passed among friends, each taking a sip or a swig, depending on their mood. People drank together, not to excess, but in companionship, to pass the time, to mark the end of the day, and there was a quiet ritual to it. You'd raise your mug, maybe murmur a word of thanks, or a short blessing if you were the religious sort. You'd clink mugs with your neighbor, not with a sharp sound, but a low, wooden knock. And then you'd drink, not to forget, but to remember the warmth of the fire, the taste of stew, the safety of walls around you, and the softness of a bench after walking too far. These drinks weren't just beverages. They were part of the rhythm of medieval life. They were slow. They were communal. They were safe in a world that often wasn't. So as you finish your cup of ale, or cider, or mead, set it down gently. Listen to the soft chatter around you. Feel the fire's warmth on your hands. And let the last drops of your drink linger on your tongue like a story not quite finished. Now the fire is burning low, and the stew pot has quieted. Your belly is full. The tankards are half drained, and the hearth flickers warmly. This is when you begin to look around, not with curiosity exactly, but with a slow, sleepy awareness. You start to notice, who else has come in out of the cold? Who else is sharing the warmth of the tavern with you? Because a medieval tavern wasn't just a place for food and drink. It was a meeting ground, a temporary shelter not just from the weather, but from the world. And the people inside, they came from all walks of life. Let's begin with the locals, the people who lived just a few cottages away, or maybe up the road, in a hamlet you passed without even noticing. These were peasants, mostly farmers, shepherds, carpenters, blacksmiths, people with dirt on their boots and sun-worn faces. They came in for the ale, for the heat of the fire, and for a chance to speak to someone besides their family or their oxen. Their clothes were rough spun wool, and linen, leather shoes, that might be patched more than once. A man might have a hood or a cloak, especially in winter. A woman might wear a simple kirtle and apron, her hair covered with a linen coif. Their voices were low. Their laughter came in short bursts. They knew each other's names, and each other's fields, and they talked not of great events, but of weather, of harvests, of animals gone missing and rumors half heard from the priest. And then, sometimes, there were travelers. You could often spot them before they even spoke. Dusty boots, a long cloak drawn against the wind, a satchel slung over the shoulder, or a pack resting by the door. Travelers came from other towns, other regions, sometimes even from across the sea. They might be messengers, pilgrims, wandering workers, or simply people on their way to somewhere else. Their clothes were more varied. A cloak of a strange pattern, a tunic of a slightly richer dye, maybe a foreign belt buckle or a brooch that caught the firelight. They came with stories, if they were in the mood to tell them. And often, the tavern keeper would ask them to share the news. What happened in the last town? Had the king passed through? Were the roads safe? Was the plague near? Travelers were welcome, mostly, though they might be eyed with a little caution at first, not out of hostility, just out of habit. Strangers were still strangers, but once their drink was poured, and their meal set before them, they became part of the night, like anyone else. Then there were the merchants. You could tell them apart by their clothing, better cut, better dye, maybe even a little embroidery if they were successful. A leather pouch with coins, a ring on the finger, not noble, but clearly above the working poor. Merchants moved from market to market, town to town, selling cloth, spices, pottery, or other goods. They were good talkers, often smiling, confident. They might sit near the fire and chat with the innkeeper about grain prices or shipping routes. But merchants didn't always talk. They sometimes kept to themselves, going over ledgers, or counting coins behind a tankard, watching, listening, weighing the world around them, always with an eye on profit, and the other on the road ahead. And once in a while, only once in a while, you'd see someone from higher society, a knight, perhaps, with spurs on his boots, and a sword resting near his bench, or a clergyman, in long robes, with a wooden cross and a satchel of scripture. These were rarer guests, and when they entered, the room changed a little. People looked up. Conversations paused, not out of fear, exactly, but out of respect, or something close to it. A knight might wear mail under his cloak, or carry a small badge of his lord's household. His clothes would be clean, his gloves thick. He'd likely have a squire or servant with him, quiet, tired, watching the door. Knights didn't always stay long. They might drink quickly, eat faster, and move on. Or they might relax, just a little, unbuckling their sword belt, leaning back with the sigh of someone who has traveled far. A monk or priest, on the other hand, would bring an entirely different energy. Calm, measured, a brown or black robe, a tonsured head, maybe a small satchel filled with dried herbs or relics. Clergy didn't always approve of taverns, of course, but they used them. They passed through them, and sometimes they'd sit at the edge of the room, murmuring prayers under their breath while others drank. And in the corner, always in the corner, there might be a musician, or a juggler, or someone with a carved flute, or a battered drum, not performing, necessarily, just present, waiting for the mood to change, for someone to ask for a song, for a coin to be tossed into their upturned hat. These weren't noble bards or trained performers, just travelers, trying to earn a few pennies by entertaining a room full of weary souls. The social dynamics of the tavern were fluid, but never equal. There were hierarchies, always. The wealthy sat closer to the fire. The locals gathered at the long benches. Strangers found their way to the corners, testing the mood before joining conversation. A knight might get his meal quicker, a priest might be served in silence, and everyone watched, quietly, not with suspicion, but with a sense of place. No one asked a knight about his wounds unless invited. No one spoke over a merchant counting his coins. No one interrupted a traveler deep in thought. There was a quiet understanding of roles, of unspoken rules. But at the same time, there was connection, because in a tavern, all of these lives brushed against one another. They sat at neighboring benches. They passed the same jug of ale. They shared the same firelight and listened to the same drifting tune. And for a few hours, they were not peasant and knight, not merchant and monk, but simply guests, in from the cold, together, resting. The fire crackled, the tankards clinked, and the smoke curled up into the rafters above them. It was one of the rare places in the medieval world where boundaries softened, if only a little, where people might laugh at the same joke, where someone might offer a piece of bread to a stranger, where stories passed between tongues and hearts, not just mouths. So next time you imagine a medieval tavern, think not only of stew and ale, but of the faces gathered there. Dirty hands and soft cloaks, rough voices and quiet prayers, boots by the door, cloaks drying by the fire. So many lives, all paused for a while, under the same smoky roof. The candles are burning low now, their wax pooling in shallow cups. The stew has been scraped from the bowls. A few guests are leaning back, lulled by warmth and drink, their voices softer than before. And in this moment, just as the silence begins to stretch, someone picks up a flute. It might be a simple reed flute, carved by hand, with just a handful of notes. The tune is slow, not precise, but it's familiar, something gentle, maybe something local, passed down from a grandmother or heard in a summer field. This was the heart of tavern entertainment in the Middle Ages. Not grand performances or raucous revelry, but quiet, human acts of passing time. When the day's work was done, and the fire was warm, music was as natural as breath. Music was everywhere in medieval life, and the tavern was no exception. If a traveler carried a lute, or a small harp, they might strum it softly in a corner, coaxing out a melody that wandered like smoke between the rafters. Sometimes it was a fiddle, played with a bough of horsehair. Sometimes a drum, thumped lightly with the heel of a hand, not to rouse the crowd, but to settle them, to mark the end of the day. Singing came too, untrained, unpolished, but heartfelt. Folk songs, drinking songs, old ballads about knights and ladies, saints and devils, the seasons and the harvest. People joined in, when they knew the words. The choruses drifted like lullabies. The melody would rise, then fall again, leaving only the crackle of the hearth behind. Sometimes, if you were lucky, there'd be a storyteller. He or she might be a traveling bard, or a local with a sharp tongue. They didn't need props, just a place to sit, a cup of ale, and a quiet audience. They'd tell tales of distant battles, of dragons in the hills, of saints who walked on water and villagers who tricked the devil. Some stories were funny, some holy, some frightening, but always, the room would fall still. You'd sip your ale more slowly. You'd forget your sore feet or the long walk home. Because stories in the Middle Ages weren't background noise. They were transport. They were television, books, and dreams rolled into one. And a good storyteller, well, they could turn a smoky tavern into a castle, a battlefield, or a haunted forest, all without leaving their bench. But not everything was quiet. Some guests wanted more lively diversions, games, contests, things to do with their hands. So they turned to dice. Dice were simple, carved from bone or wood, sometimes uneven, sometimes marked with symbols instead of numbers. But they were endlessly entertaining. Games of luck, of guessing, of betting. The clatter of dice on a wooden table was a familiar sound in any tavern. Bets were whispered. Coins slid forward. There were always groans, and sometimes cheers, when the dice came to rest. And along with dice came other board games. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, people played games that feel familiar today. One of the oldest was a form of backgammon, called tables in medieval England. 2 players, a wooden board, and a handful of counters. The rules varied from region to region, but the rhythm was the same, slow, thoughtful. A mix of luck and strategy. You moved your pieces around the board, tried to block your opponent, and kept an eye on the door in case someone came in with better news or stronger ale. Then there was chess, though it was rarer in common taverns, more likely to appear in places with wealthier clientele. Chess came to Europe through Islamic Spain, and became a game of strategy and symbolism. Kings and queens, bishops and knights, all moving carefully on a checkered board. It wasn't just a pastime. It was a mental duel, played in silence, broken only by the occasional murmur, or the scrape of wood on wood. And of course, there were card games, though these were more common by the late Middle Ages. Early decks looked nothing like ours today, and they were often hand-painted or woodcut. But even then, people played for coin, for pride, or just to pass the long hours of night. Not all games were quiet or contained. In some towns and larger cities, there were more brutal entertainments that might bleed into the tavern yard. These included cockfighting, roosters pitted against each other in cruel, noisy contests. It wasn't common in every village, and certainly not every tavern, but in places where crowds gathered, bets were laid and feathers flew. Worse still, some inns, especially those near town markets or traveling fairs, hosted bear baiting, where a chained bear was set upon by dogs for the crowd's amusement. It was loud, bloody, and deeply unsettling to modern ears. But in the medieval mindset, it was seen as sport, a test of bravery, a spectacle. Thankfully, it wasn't part of everyday tavern life. These events were occasional, and usually outdoors. The tavern itself was more likely to hear about such things than to host them. More often than not, tavern entertainment was low stakes and intimate. A game of dice between 2 travelers, a song sung to no one in particular, a riddle told at a table, passed like a cup of wine, from one voice to another. Sometimes, a local might challenge a guest to a contest, not of strength, but of wit. Riddles were popular in many parts of Europe, especially in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. I am tall when I'm young, and short when I'm old. What am I? The answer, of course, is a candle. But in a tavern, that little mystery could spark 10 minutes of laughter, debate, and clever guessing. In the end, tavern entertainment wasn't about winning or impressing. It was about easing the quiet, about filling the space between bites, between drinks, between the end of one story and the start of the next. It was about the comfort of familiarity, the warmth of human voices, the joy of play in a world that didn't offer much softness. So if you ever imagine yourself in a medieval tavern, lean back against the wall, close your eyes, and listen. Hear the notes of a wandering lute player, the thump of a drum, the clatter of dice. Feel the hush as a story begins, or the sudden laughter when a riddle's punchline lands. And know that in this place, muddy floors and all, people found small, fleeting joys. And those joys mattered. Even in a world of toil and shadow, they found room to sing. The fire crackles softly now, its light casting long, flickering shadows against the tavern walls. The last song has faded into silence. Dice have been stashed away, and the loot rests quietly in its case. Around the rough wooden tables, people lean in a little closer, not for music or laughter now, but for something quieter, something more curious, something human. Gossip. In the medieval world, where letters were rare and travel was slow, the tavern became one of the most important centers of information exchange. It wasn't a library, it wasn't an official hall of records, but it was something perhaps even more influential, a place where stories lived and spread. When people gathered in taverns, locals and travelers alike, they brought more than their appetites. They brought news, or at least fragments of it. Hints, whispers, bits and pieces that may or may not have been true. A man walks in from the next village over and mentions, in passing, that the baker's daughter ran off with the miller's apprentice. It's repeated once, then twice, then twisted slightly, and by the end of the night, the story has become that she ran off with a knight and stole a sack of gold. No one knows which version is real, but it doesn't really matter, because in the medieval tavern, gossip was a kind of entertainment, a communal pastime, a way to understand the world, however flawed or exaggerated. You'd hear about who was courting whom, whose crops failed, whose ox had gone lame. You'd hear about a neighbor's sudden illness, or the blacksmith's new apprentice. These were stories that shaped the rhythm of daily life. But gossip didn't stop at the village boundary. When travelers entered the tavern, the curiosity grew sharper. People leaned forward, speaking softer, hoping for some news from beyond. Is the plague in York? Has the Baron returned from the border? Did you pass the bishop's men on the road? Is there talk of war in France? The answers were rarely complete. Sometimes they were wrong, but they were all pieces of the puzzle. And in a world without newspapers or evening broadcasts, this was how you stayed connected to a larger world, the world beyond your own muddy lane. Taverns were political, too, in their own quiet way. Not every peasant talked politics, of course, but taxes, land disputes, and feudal lords were part of everyday life, and they naturally became part of the tavern conversation. People shared complaints about rents. They muttered about a new toll on the bridge, or a priest who demanded too much tithe. When kings went to war or when nobles rebelled, the stories came tumbling in behind them, often vague, sometimes contradictory. The Duke has raised a banner, someone might say. They say he's marching east. Then another might chime in, nonsense. I heard he's been taken by the king's men. They're hanging rebels in the square. Most of this was second-hand, third-hand, or less. But even if the facts were foggy, the emotion was real. Fear, hope, pride, resentment. These feelings were poured into tankards alongside the ale. And in that dimly lit room, they passed from one mind to another. Sometimes, though, the gossip wasn't just idle chatter, because as long as there were rumors, there were people who wanted to hear them, and not for entertainment. Every so often, especially in larger towns or places near roads of strategic importance, spies and informants might pass through. They didn't wear black cloaks or lurk in corners like in stories. They were more subtle. A man traveling alone, a woman with a keen ear and an innocent smile, a monk asking gentle questions, a soldier who didn't seem quite drunk enough. They listened. They remembered who said what, which villages were restless, which knights had loyal men and which didn't, who muttered too loudly about the king, who praised a rebel noble just a little too openly. And sometimes, they reported back to a sheriff, a bailiff, or even a bishop. But most patrons never noticed. They were too wrapped in their own conversations, too focused on the next story, or the stew, or the way the firelight danced in their tankard. Because most of the time, gossip felt safe. It was natural, human. It filled the space between chores and sleep. People didn't think of themselves as spreading dangerous talk. They were simply passing along what they'd heard. And in the telling, their world grew just a little bigger. A woman might hear that her cousin in the next town has married a carpenter. A farmer might learn that the abbot of the nearby monastery has died. A merchant might discover that the salt tax is about to rise again, and make plans accordingly. And sometimes, someone would tell a story so bizarre, so outlandish, that it would be met with laughter and disbelief. A fish with wings, you say? A knight who turned into a swan? Oh, come now. And yet, the story would be repeated, embellished, carried onward. These were not just tales. They were the beginnings of myths, of legends. the seeds of folklore that would take root and grow over generations. In this way, medieval taverns were like the nervous system of the age, carrying signals, stories, and emotions from one part of the realm to another, not always reliably, but always constantly. Even the church noticed. Some priests warned against idle talk and the sin of rumor. Others simply acknowledged that taverns were too central to resist. Some even used them, sitting quietly in a corner, gathering news before Sunday's sermon. After all, to shepherd a flock, one had to know what the flock was whispering. So while the tavern may have looked like a simple place, a wooden room with smoke in the air and stew on the fire, it was also a conduit, a place where information pulsed, like the lifeblood of a very human world. In one moment, someone might tell a tale of ghosts in the woods. In the next, a murmur would begin about taxes rising or war on the horizon. And as the candles burned lower, and the guests leaned closer, those whispers wove themselves into something more than stories. They became truths, of a sort. Not the truths you find in books, but the kind passed from voice to voice, by people who lived close to the land and close to one another. So next time you imagine a medieval tavern, don't just picture ale and fear light. Picture conversations, soft, slow, sometimes silly, sometimes serious. Picture a room humming with the life of 100 stories, flickering in and out like shadows on the wall. Because in the Middle Ages, to sit in a tavern wasn't just to eat and drink. It was to listen, to speak, to remember, to take part in the great, unending murmur of the world. The candles are burning low now. One by one, they flicker and go out, leaving long shadows along the timbered walls. Most of the dice have been packed away. The songs have grown quiet. A few guests begin to yawn into their sleeves. But not everyone is settling. Some voices are still raised, just slightly. A man argues over the outcome of a card game. Someone else is muttering that his cup was short-filled. A group near the hearth begins to laugh too loudly, and a stool topples over with a sharp thud on the floor. This is the part of the night when a tavern could shift from cozy to tense, from warmth to watchfulness. Because for all their merriment, medieval taverns were not free-for-alls. They lived within a framework of rules, both spoken and unspoken. Not every tavern was the same, but most had some form of expected behavior, and most communities had laws, formal and informal, about what went on behind a tavern's doors. At the most basic level, there were curfews. Many medieval towns and villages had regulations requiring taverns to close at certain hours, particularly in winter when the nights were long. Bells might toll from the church to signal when the day's business should be done. In some places, tavern keepers could face fines, or even brief imprisonment if they served past the appointed hour. The reason was simple: drunkenness brought trouble. It wasn't just about noise or disorder. In a world with no streetlights, no police force as we know it, and few ways to call for help in the night, public peace was fragile. Fights could spill out into dark alleys, knives could flash, and disputes could lead to real harm before anyone intervened. So towns and manorial lords imposed laws on how taverns were run. In many places, these were written down as part of local bylaws or assizes of ale, community inspections that monitored the quality of drink, the behavior of keepers, and even the fairness of prices. Tavern keepers had a tough job. They were responsible not only for serving food and drink, but also for keeping the peace. And when peace broke down, the consequences could be sharp. If a fight broke out, it wasn't just frowned upon. It was often punishable by fine, or worse. A brawl might cost a man a few pennies, paid directly to the local reeve or bailiff. In some towns, the tavern keeper might be fined as well, especially if he was seen as negligent. If someone drew a knife, or worse, spilled blood, the punishment could escalate quickly, sometimes even resulting in imprisonment or public shaming. Cheating at games was another common source of strife. Dice games were simple, but they involved money, pride, and the ever-present possibility of deceit. Loaded dice, false rolls, or even stolen winnings could provoke accusations. A man accused of cheating might be banned from the tavern, or forced to pay restitution. In some places, the cheating itself was a legal offense, punishable in local court. That's why some taverns posted rules openly, often scrawled on parchment and hung near the hearth or door. These might include: no fighting, no weapons at the table, no cheating at games, no serving after curfew, no loud singing after dark. These rules weren't always enforced evenly. Much depended on the temperament of the keeper and the customs of the village. In some places, a scuffle might be laughed off. In others, it might lead to a visit from the local constable. Some tavern keepers had their own strategies for avoiding trouble. They might quietly stop serving ale to a guest who was becoming too loud. They might position a trusted friend or hired hand, essentially an early version of a bouncer, near the door to watch for signs of brewing tension. And in many cases, the keeper's own reputation was enough to keep guests in line, because no one wanted to be banned from the tavern. In a small town, being turned away from the local alehouse was not just inconvenient, it was social exile. You missed out on news, on work opportunities, on companionship. You were seen as disruptive, unreliable. So for most patrons, the threat of exclusion was enough to keep tempers from boiling over. That said, drunken brawls were not rare, especially on feast days or market nights. When emotions ran high and pockets were full, things could turn chaotic. A boast taken the wrong way, a lost bet, a spilled drink, all could spark a fight. These brawls weren't usually deadly, but they were noisy, messy affairs. Wooden stools knocked over, tankards shattered, two men grappling on the floor, grunting and cursing, while others either egged them on or tried to pull them apart. And in the aftermath, if blood was drawn, someone might be dragged to the stocks the next day, to sit in public shame, nursing both wounds and regret. Some taverns banned weapons entirely, especially in urban areas. Guests might be asked to check their swords or daggers at the door. This wasn't just for safety, it was a sign that inside the tavern, disputes should be settled with words, not steel. Still, weapons were everywhere in medieval life. A belt knife was as common as a coin purse, and sometimes, even a drinking bench could become a weapon in the heat of the moment. That's why many tavern keepers preferred to encourage calmness by design. Fires were kept burning low, not roaring. Light music was encouraged. Food was always available, even late into the night, because a full stomach tends to dull a sharp tongue. And regulars were sometimes quietly seated apart from known troublemakers. There was a certain social choreography at play, an unspoken system of warnings, nods, and glances that kept the peace without shouting or force. And, of course, there were women in taverns too, sometimes as keepers, sometimes as guests, sometimes as entertainers or servers. Their presence could both soothe and provoke. In some places, a flirt gone too far could trigger jealous words. In others, women were peacemakers, reminding the men to behave, or quietly guiding them to the door before tempers could rise. It's worth noting that tavern culture was deeply local. What was acceptable in one region might be forbidden in another. A coastal town might be used to rowdy sailors, while a rural village prized quiet and discretion. Some taverns were known for being rough and wild. Others were genteel, almost refined. But all taverns shared one constant, the ever-present possibility of disorder, and the equally strong desire to avoid it, because no one wanted to lose the sanctuary of the tavern. It was more than a place to drink. It was a place to rest, to belong, to feel human after a long day, in the fields or on the road. And so, even the roughest guests knew that the line had to be drawn somewhere. So as the night draws on, and voices grow slower, softer, you can feel that balance still at play. A man bites back an insult. Another decides not to throw that last, losing coin. A guest who's had too much is quietly walked to a bench by the fire, and left to snore into his cloak. Peace, hard-won and fragile, lingers over the tavern like smoke. And outside, beyond the wooden door, the cold night waits. The last embers of the fire glow low in the hearth, casting only the faintest orange shimmer across the flagstone floor. The songs have faded. The tankards are empty. Even the most talkative patrons have grown quiet now. Just the occasional snore, a sleepy cough, or the creak of a settling timber breaks the silence. It's time to sleep. But where? In the modern world, we're used to inns and hotels with neat little rooms, fresh white sheets, and maybe even a mint on the pillow. But the medieval tavern wasn't quite so accommodating. There were no guarantees, no keys to turn, no privacy, and often, no beds. If you were lucky, truly lucky, the tavern you visited might have a room upstairs. Not your own room, of course. That idea was still centuries away for most people. What you'd likely find was a shared sleeping space, a simple chamber with low ceilings, packed with straw-stuffed mattresses, or rough pallets made of wood and cloth. If there were beds at all, they were often shared between strangers. The idea of a bed for one person would have seemed indulgent, even a little odd. You'd climb in next to someone who might be a merchant, a farmer, a tinker, or even a traveling priest. You might not know their name. You probably wouldn't ask. You'd just turn your back, pull your cloak tighter, and try to get some rest. The mattresses were usually sacks stuffed with straw. Not fresh straw, either, at least not always. Over time, they grew lumpy, damp, and home to uninvited guests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were a common reality, not a rare inconvenience. A bite or two was just part of the experience. The blankets, if there were any, were shared as well. Rough wool, sometimes damp from the night air or spilled ale. If you had your own cloak or blanket, you guarded it carefully. It was warmth, protection, and a bit of home rolled into one. The air in the sleeping room was thick, warm from bodies, sharp with sweat, tinged with the smoke that rose through the floorboards from the hearth below. Someone might snore. Another might talk in their sleep. The man next to you might shift, scratch, or mutter a prayer in Latin as he drifted off. If the tavern had no sleeping room, and many didn't, your options narrowed. Some guests would stumble out into the night, making their way home on foot, down crooked lanes lit only by moonlight and memory. They'd sway past fields, past hedges, past sleeping dogs and shuttered windows. If they were lucky, they'd reach home before the cold set in. If not, they might wake in the ditch, wet and shivering, their heads pounding with regret. Others would stay inside, curling up on benches near the hearth or even on the floor, if the keeper allowed it. Some keepers encouraged this. They preferred to have people inside and calm, rather than staggering through town in the dark. And in the colder months, many were too kind, or too practical, to force someone out into the frost. So you'd find a few cloaked figures nestled near the fire, cloaks pulled up over their heads, boots still on, breath rising in faint white puffs. A dog might be curled up nearby, snoring softly, sharing its warmth without complaint. It wasn't comfortable. The floor was hard. The air was smoky, and the tavern never fully slept. Somewhere, someone would rise to relieve themselves. Somewhere, a board would creak. Somewhere, the last coals would shift, popping softly in the grate. But even in this discomfort, there was a kind of peace, because sleep was not a private, luxurious ritual. It was just the next part of the day, a pause between labors, a time to lie still, let the aches dull, and drift into dreams. And sometimes, those dreams were interrupted. There were stories, quiet ones, often whispered rather than written, of thieves who crept into taverns at night to cut purses, or snatch a cloak. There were moments when a snoring guest might wake to find someone rummaging near his pack. And now and then, a quarrel from earlier in the night would rekindle in the dark, low voices, then louder ones, then a sharp crash of something falling. When that happened, the tavern keeper, or their spouse, might rouse themselves with a heavy sigh, climb the stairs, and bark a warning. Usually, that was enough. Sleep would return, awkward and uneasy, but it would return. Of course, some guests, especially the well-to-do, didn't sleep in the tavern at all. A merchant with a horse and coin to spare might stay at an inn, where accommodations were slightly better. A knight might find lodging with a local nobleman, or in a monastic guest house. But for the average traveler, for the laborer, the peasant, the journeyman, the pilgrim, it was the tavern or the open road. And even with its rough beds and crowded rooms, the tavern had a kind of warmth, a roof, a fire, a few soft sounds of other people breathing nearby. You weren't alone. And in a world filled with wolves, wild weather, and wandering spirits, that counted for a great deal, there was, too, a kind of shared humanity in those sleeping spaces. Strangers laying side by side. No titles, no fine garments, just tired people with sore feet and full bellies, trying to get through another cold night. The same fleas bit everyone, the same fire warmed them, and in that moment, half asleep, half aware, everyone was equal. As dawn approached, the room would stir again. A cough here, a yawn there, someone stretching, someone groaning as they tried to unknit stiff joints. Boots slipped on, cloaks fastened, faces splashed with water, if it was available. And slowly, the tavern would return to life. Another day, another journey, another story to tell at the next fire, in the next town. So as you lie here, with the imagined scent of smoke and old wool in your nose. Imagine yourself not in a king's chamber or a knight's tent, but in the quiet, shared sleep of the common folk, maybe by the fire, maybe on a lumpy straw sack, a dog's warm flank pressed against your boot, a stranger's soft snore behind you, your own breath rising and falling in the cold morning air. It's not a perfect rest, but it's real, and it's yours. Let's imagine, for a moment, that you're back in the corner of a quiet medieval tavern. The fire's burned down to embers. A few patrons remain, speaking softly over drained mugs. Outside, the moon sits low over rooftops and fields. All seems still. But what you might not realize, what's easy to miss beneath the surface, is that this tavern, this simple little room with its smoke-blackened beams and dusty floorboards, is much more than it seems. Because in the medieval world, a tavern wasn't just a place to drink and pass the time. It was a social engine, a community heartbeat, a room where decisions were made, alliances were formed, and the rhythm of life played itself out in ways both large and small. Let's begin with the guilds. In towns and cities across medieval Europe, guilds were the organizations that held society together. There were merchant guilds, craftsmen's guilds, butchers' guilds, weavers, masons, blacksmiths, and more. Guilds protected their members, regulated prices, trained apprentices, and set standards for work. But where did these guilds meet? Not always in town halls, not in churches. Very often, they met right here, in the local tavern. In fact, many guilds had reserved spaces in specific taverns. Some even had long-standing relationships with particular establishments, returning to the same table or private room week after week, year after year. Over mugs of ale and plates of bread and cheese, they would discuss trade rules, internal disputes, and seasonal dues. The atmosphere was informal, but the matters were serious. Elections for guild officers might take place here. So, might votes on whether to accept a new apprentice, settle a disagreement between members, or organize a joint project, like funding a chapel or repairing a bridge. The tavern was a place of trust, where one could speak freely without the echoing formality of a stone hall. The presence of food and drink gave meetings a social texture that formal spaces often lacked. Deals were sealed with handshakes over shared bread. Debts remembered and drink were rarely forgotten. And the guilds weren't alone. In many towns, local councils, especially smaller, informal ones, also met in taverns. These weren't always the highest city authorities, but more often the working councils of parish leaders, aldermen, or village elders. When decisions needed to be made about local roads, market days, or the care of the poor, it was easier, and warmer, to meet in a tavern than in a draughty hall. This was particularly true in rural villages, where the tavern might be the only public building besides the church. In places with no formal council chamber, the tavern's back room became the de facto seat of government. Some taverns even hosted court sessions, yes, real legal proceedings. This was especially common in manorial courts, where the local lord or his steward would hear disputes among villagers. The issues might range from land boundaries to crop damage, theft, or failure to pay dues. The setting wasn't grand. There might be a table, a candle, a record book, and a few stools. But justice, however local and uneven, was dispensed. In fact, some taverns were so closely tied to local governance that they became known as court taverns, where villagers would gather not only to drink but to witness rulings, and have their own cases heard. You might imagine a scene like this. A crowded room, half filled with villagers. The steward sits at the head of a long wooden table, flanked by two clerks. A pig has wandered into someone's field, and now there's a dispute over damages. Witnesses are called, voices rise and fall, and in the corner, someone pours another mug of ale, waiting for their turn. It was rough justice, but it was also immediate, local, and rooted in a space that people knew. And beyond the courts and councils, the tavern served as a kind of message board for the town or village. When travelers passed through, they brought news about distant battles, royal edicts, or harvest conditions elsewhere. That news was shared first in the tavern, passed from table to table. When taxes were announced, or soldiers passed through, or a new law was declared, the news might be pinned to the door of the tavern, or read aloud by the tavern keeper or an official, so that all could hear. In some regions, The tavern also played a spiritual or charitable role. Local religious fraternities, small groups devoted to charity or prayer, sometimes met in taverns after church services. They might plan a donation for a sick neighbor, organize a small feast for a holy day, or just spend time in mutual company. Drinking was done in moderation, and the mood was one of fellowship more than revelry. Likewise, tavern keepers themselves were often respected figures in their communities. They knew everyone. They saw everything. They served as informal mediators, matchmakers, keepers of secrets, and occasionally even confessors. Their taverns were not just businesses, but community hearths. In the countryside, where homes were spread far apart, the tavern offered something rare, a shared space, a room where people of different backgrounds, farmers, millers, travelers, even clergy, could gather without ceremony. In a world of strict social hierarchy, the tavern was one of the few places where boundaries sometimes softened. Of course, this didn't mean total equality. The wealthy still had better seats. Clergy might be offered private rooms, and women's presence varied widely, from full participation to near complete exclusion, depending on region and local custom. But still, in a quiet way, the tavern held the community together. It was a space that reflected the mood of the people. On feast days, it was joyful, filled with music, laughter, and spilled ale. In times of war or famine, it was solemn, a place where people gathered not to celebrate, but to understand what was happening around them. Through it all, the tavern endured. Rain or shine, peace or rebellion, the tavern was always there, standing beside the road, or behind the market square, or beneath the old church bell. Its walls absorbed the stories of generations. Its floors bore the weight of boots, hooves, and dancing feet. Its benches held the tired, the cheerful, the drunk, and the hopeful. And when the church bells rang, or the town crier shouted, or the harvest failed, people didn't gather in silence. They gathered in the tavern. Now that we've spent a long, quiet evening in a typical medieval tavern, warming ourselves by the hearth, nursing a mug of ale, and maybe even finding a corner to doze in, it's time to imagine something broader, something wider than one village or town. Let's lift ourselves gently from the straw and stretch our minds across the medieval map. Because while the tavern may seem like a universal thing, firelight, laughter, the smell of roasted meat, it was far from identical from place to place. In fact, a tavern in England might feel very different from one in France, and even more different still from one in the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Let's take a quiet walk across borders. There's no rush, just a slow drifting from one land to another, as if in a soft dream. Along the way, we'll visit 3 kinds of taverns, English, French, and German, and we'll see how climate, architecture, customs, and language gave each its own distinct flavor. We begin in England. Imagine a country road just outside a sleepy English village. The air is damp with fog, hedgerows drip with recent rain, and your boots squish in the soft mud. Off to one side stands a timber-framed building with a low, sagging roof and smoke curling from the chimney. This is your tavern for the night. English taverns were often modest structures, wattle and daub walls, wooden beams, and roofs made from thatch or shingles. The climate in England was rarely kind, long wet winters, cool summers, and lots of overcast skies. So English taverns were built for warmth and coziness, often huddled tightly around a large hearth, where patrons could gather. Inside, the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and ale filled the air. Meals were heavy and hearty, pottage, bread, cheese, and meat when available. The drink of choice was usually ale or cider, often brewed by the tavern keeper themselves, with recipes that varied from village to village. These taverns were community hubs, where locals came to talk, sing, and sometimes argue. Entertainment leaned toward storytelling, often passed down orally, and often delivered with a touch of English wit, dry, understated, and just a little mischievous. But now let's float across the English Channel, where the fog lifts slightly and the air begins to carry the scent of wine and lavender. We are now in France. The French tavern, or taverne, or sometimes cabaret, was a different creature altogether. Though it shared the same purpose of food, drink, and gathering, its architecture, ambience, and social function were often more elaborate. Many French taverns were built of stone in southern regions, or a mix of timber and plaster in the north. They were more likely to have arched doorways, larger open windows, and courtyards where patrons could drink and eat beneath the sky in warmer months. Climate played its part here. Southern France, with its Mediterranean influence, was warmer and drier, allowing for al fresco gatherings and shaded patios. In the north, taverns offered more shelter but were still more open and airy than their English counterparts. Inside, the air might smell not just of stew and ale, but also of wine, herbs, soft cheeses, and fresh bread. French taverns leaned heavily into wine culture. Many were tied directly to vineyards and vintners. Discussions about wine were common, and a good vintage could be the talk of the town. Socially, French taverns often felt more lively, and at times, more boisterous. Singing, dancing, and even rudimentary theater performances were common in urban taverns. A group of traveling minstrels might perform in exchange for supper and coin, while jesters or poets shared tales of courtly love, or tales from the latest crusade. You'd also find more women present in French taverns, not just as guests, but as servers, singers, and even proprietors. In some regions, women ran the entire tavern, managing food, drink, and trade. These spaces were more social than utilitarian, and less restricted by rigid gender roles than in other regions. Now, let's go further east still, through wooded hills and deep river valleys, to the scattered principalities and city-states of the Holy Roman Empire, the German-speaking lands of the Middle Ages. Here, we find a Wirtshaus, schnkE, or Gaststube, words that each suggest a slightly different type of establishment, but all carry the same idea, a place to rest, eat, drink, and gather. German taverns were often large and sturdily built, with thick half-timbered walls, steep pitched roofs to keep off heavy snows, and wide cellars below for storing beer and provisions. Many taverns had wooden carvings and painted signs over the door, often depicting animals or coats of arms, symbols for the illiterate to recognize. And of course, there was beer. Lots of it. Unlike the English, who brewed ale with no hops, or the French, who preferred wine, the Germans embraced the use of hops in brewing early on. This gave their beer a longer shelf life and a distinctive bitterness. Many towns even had laws protecting the purity of beer, long before the famous Reinheitsgebot of 1516. Inside a German tavern, the sounds were full-bodied, boisterous toasts, clinking mugs, and choral singing that echoed off wooden beams. The climate, cold in winter, wet in spring, meant these taverns had to be sturdy, warm, and deeply communal. Here, social customs were very strong. Toasting had rules. You looked your fellow drinkers in the eye. You said the proper words. You respected the rhythm of the evening. Entertainment ranged from folk music to dance, and even guild meetings. Some German taverns served double duty as halls for local trade guilds, making them political as well as social spaces. And if you stayed the night, as you might, you'd probably find yourself in a large, shared room, not unlike those in England, or perhaps curled near a tiled stove, feet still warm from the fire. In all these places, whether England, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, the tavern reflected its environment. It was shaped by climate, warm and close in rainy England, breezy and open in southern France, fortified and fire-lit in snowy Bavaria. It reflected architecture, from timber to stone to plaster. And it reflected culture, the flavors, sounds, and social expectations that made each region unique. But for all their differences, each tavern still served the same gentle purpose: a roof in the rain, a seat by the fire, a mug, a meal, and a moment of shared human comfort. And perhaps that's what matters most of all. Whether you were listening to English riddles, French chansons, or German drinking songs, the spirit of the tavern was the same: togetherness, warmth, and rest, offered freely, for as long as the fire still burned. So here we are, at the quiet end of our journey. The fire in the hearth has burned low. The last candle flickers in a brass dish near the back wall. Outside, the streets are empty now, save for the occasional hoot of an owl, or the soft creak of a swinging sign above the tavern door. Everyone has gone home. The stools are stacked, the tankards washed, or at least rinsed. The air is thick with the scent of smoke, warm bread, and the faint memory of laughter. And as we sit here, alone but not lonely, we find ourselves thinking, what was it really like in a medieval tavern?